Welcome, everyone. This is Mr. Simone. We're going to begin our economic history unit for APUS history. So remember, there will be two versions of the videos. This will be the abbreviated version for just the basics, and then feel free to reach out to my advanced version if you want a much more detailed explanation of American history. So let us begin. In 1754, the French and Indian War started. This was a conflict between the British and the colonists who were fighting against the French and the Native Americans. The only Native American group that sided with the British were the Iroquois. They're fighting over the Ohio River Valley region. It's largely a territorial dispute. It's also being fought in Europe. There it was called the 7 Years' War. And the key fact from this conflict that we should all know is that the Secretary of State for Parliament for the British Crown, William Pitt, he had made a deal, an unofficial deal, but a deal with the colonists, saying that if we get enough of you to volunteer to help out in the war effort, we will take care, meaning Parliament will take care of the cost of the war. But they never followed through on this when the war was over. So the key term you'd like to be familiar with is salutary neglect. Now, we learned about mercantilism, that the economic system was for the colonies to benefit for the mother country. So Britain had all of these laws. They were called Navigation Acts. They were already in existence. They were regulating the trade of the colonists, severely restricting where they can and can't sell goods. But those laws were not really well enforced. And that's called salutary neglect. So it's when you have laws, but you just don't really enforce them. But now, after the French and Indian War is over, this is why it's a turning point. The laws rather, are going to be more heavily enforced, and this is what leads to the conflict. So it's a turning point. 1763 is the key dividing year, and now for the next decade or so, we're just going to have a series of acts and events that are going to ultimately lead up to the American Revolution. So 1763 to 1775, that's our era of the cause of the American Revolution. The first one, although not economic in nature, I always want to go over it just because I think it's a critical moment. In 1763, there was conflict with Native Americans, with settlers who were moving west. And an event called Pontiac's Rebellion is when a certain Native American group and white settlers had a major confrontation. So the British government, trying to prevent that conflict from happening again, issued the Proclamation of 1763. And this specifically said, that line here, the green line, that colonists cannot move west of the Appalachian Mountains. Now, they were doing it primarily to avoid, another, flare-up, but the colonists viewed it as the British telling them what they can and can't do. So that's what really, sparks the like I said, decade-long conflict between the colonists and the British. So these are some of the acts that are going to be passed. The Stamp Act was a tax on all legal documents. It's really the first internal tax that the colonists were being forced to pay. They're being asked to pay a tax on goods that they were making inside the colonies. Then the Sugar Act is just a tax on sugar. The Townshend Act is a series of taxes. It's a tax on lead, paper, paint, glass, but the one that bothered them the most was the tax on tea. And then when they repeal the Townshend Acts, they keep the Tea Act, so that tax on that very hot commodity, no pun intended, but I guess it would have been a good pun, was the one that's really going to be the cause of the revolution. So now, before we get to how the Tea Act exploded, the Boston Massacre was 1770. They were protesting against these taxes, and 5 colonists were shot and killed outside of a Boston customs house. Most people think that somebody threw a rock inside of a snowball just to precipitate this, but it is considered one of the most significant events of the pre-revolutionary era. Then I have the Boston Tea Party here. So again, the tax on tea is what really infuriated the colonists. However, it's always important to note that the price, so you could get tea from 2 different places. You could buy it from the British, or you could smuggle it in illegally. But as a student once told me a long, long time ago, the tax on tea that was smuggled was actually still more expensive than the tax tea. So sometimes people think it's more the principle of taxation and not the actual burden that upset them. The response to this, Parliament really lays down a very restrictive series of laws called the Coercive Acts. The colonists called them the Intolerable Acts, and it punishes Massachusetts severely for their actions in the Boston Tea Party. So again, and I should have said this earlier, the colonists dressed up as Native Americans, and they dumped 342 chests of tea into the Boston Harbor. That's what the Boston Tea Party is, their protest against the tax. And the response, like I said, really infuriated the colonists, and some people think at this point it was probably just too late for them to go back. All right, so the slogan, "No taxation without representation," became the rally cry for the colonists, and it's because they don't have anybody in Parliament who they directly elected to represent them. Now, some people argued, but since we did have a representative body, virtually you were represented. But that didn't seem to fly with many of the colonists who were looking to revolt. Now, prior to, well, I should say right after the Battle of Lexington and Concord, which we've done earlier, that was the shot heard around the world in 1775, this English immigrant, Thomas Paine, published a pamphlet called Common Sense, and it sold an enormous number of copies. And the argument was that the colonists should not allow a country that's an ocean away to rule them, that it just makes common sense for them to revolt. And the popularity of this document really did lead to 1776 being the defining year for revolution. So that in 1776, that is when the Declaration of Independence was officially drafted. It was a 5-man committee that was involved in this, but Thomas Jefferson gets most of the credit. And the Declaration of Independence is really directed primarily at the king. And it is a list of all of their grievances and why they're upset and why they're deciding to break away. The formal document was, officially finished on July 4th, but again, it took several months for this all to play out. And of course, that leads to the American Revolution. So that's my brief version, economic history. I think for you, you have to start to think about if it was the taxation that was most infuriated the colonists, or if it was really more just politically them not being happy with being ruled by a country an ocean away. All right, I got it done quickly. And again, you can go to the more advanced version if you want, and you can also read the notes that I posted on Google Classroom. Take care, everyone.